Okay, looks like we have everyone here. The City Council Committee on Ordinances, Licenses, and Legal Affairs, co-posted with the Committee of the Whole, will meet remotely on Monday, May 9th, 2022 at 6 p.m. for the purposes of discussing zoning Bridge Street Neck Overlay District via remote participation in accordance with Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, as amended by Chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022. The subcommittee meetings are held to take action for the purpose of making recommendations to the full council. Individuals may participate remotely in the meeting via a remote participation platform called Zoom. Members of the public and/or parties with a right and/or requirement to attend this meeting may access the remote participation meeting through any one of the following ways. Click on the link at zoom.us to join webinar ID 834-1099-5259, password 199542, or call in via telephone 877-853-5257. Same webinar and password just noted. Every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event that we are unable to do so on matters not requiring a public hearing, we will post on the City of Salem's website an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive recording of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting. Persons requiring auxiliary aids and services for effective communication, such as sign language interpreter, an assisted listening device, or print material in digital format, or a reasonable modification in program services, policies, or activities, may contact the City of Salem ADA coordinator as soon as possible and no less than 2 business days before the meeting, program, or event. Notice of this meeting was posted on May 4th, 2022 at 3:06 p.m. This meeting is being recorded. In attendance, we have all members of the OLA committee. Thank you. We also have from Committee of the Whole, Councillor Watson-Felt, Council President Morcillo, Councillor Merkel, Councillor Hapworth, and Councillor McLean. We also have joining us this evening from the City of Salem, Amanda Chiancola from the Planning Department, and from MAPC, Chris Kushel, sorry if I didn't pronounce that properly, who has been working on this project almost as long as all of us. I loved Councillor Watson-Felt's comment about how Amanda was with child when this first started, and now that child is walking and talking and eating. So it's we are all working to help create this new zoning ordinance that has been in the works for a long time. So this was at joint public hearing on April 13th, 2022, and the next day it was referred to the planning board, where they met and discussed it on April 14th. The joint public hearing, there were lots of good comments that were brought out, including some members of the council here, as well as the planning board recommendation that came back to the council included some comments and feedback, specifically around the administrative review in the zoning ordinance, the design standard guidelines, planned unit development, density, the design review board recommendation, a comment on hedging versus shrubbery, and to differentiate between common, open, and vehicular spaces. So because of the comments received during joint public hearing, as well as the recommendation from the planning board, this has been referred to OLA, so we can hopefully work through those fine-tuned items and get to a version that we're comfortable with recommending back to full council. Timeline-wise, I did want to touch on that really briefly. You'll have to bear with me, I didn't have that up, I'm sorry. But I do want to touch on the timeline. So because this joint public hearing was closed on April 14th, we have 90 days from date of closure for first and second passage with council. So this was held on the 13th and closed on the 13th. So 90 days is July 12th. So we really have our 2 June meetings if needed. So first passage would be due by June 6th and second passage June 23rd. So we do have the month of May basically to work this out in OLA if needed. We have some additional restraints around the month of May, but we'll get to those details if we need to going forward. So all of the technical, commentary out of the way from myself, I would like to throw it over to Amanda, if you don't mind. She put together a kind of a consolidated presentation versus what we saw. So we all, I believe, were at the joint public hearing where we saw the larger presentation. I asked Amanda to kind of do a little bit more of a consolidated one specifically to the points that came back from the planning board and commentary that was received during the joint public hearing. So if we could maybe do like a brief overview of that and then open it up for comments and questions. Does that sound good from the committee? Any comments? Okay, awesome. Ready to rock and roll.
Hi, good evening. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak tonight. As Council Chair Riccardi and mentioned, I have Chris with me from MAPC, and we put together this short presentation to just go over the planning board recommendations. Shared. So what we'd like to do is take the recommendations out into the chunks you see here. These are the, there are a few points here. Each one is one of the recommendations, but we split it up this way with some subtext under this bold one, specifically the design standards to guidelines recommendation, because all of these other items are really impacted by whether there are design standards or design guidelines in the ordinance. And so what we'd like to do is go through each recommendation and then ask for members of the public if it's okay to take public comment, and for Ola to discuss this and then provide feedback on how you would recommend staff move forward with editing the ordinance, if you accept the planning board's recommendation or not, because that will just help inform the next section. So that's where you'll see the change from design standards to guidelines. After we understand the approach you'd like to take there, that we go through administrative review, the planned unit developments, the design review board. The increase of density is sort of a separate thing that we can take, whether there are standards or guidelines that isn't as impacted, and that would be another discussion. And then language clarifications are pretty straightforward. So that part will be the shorter part. And then at the end is, we'll just open up to any other comments on the ordinance. So that approach is okay. We'll move on. So this is the planning board's rationale for changing the design standards to guidelines. The planning board had stated that the standards were too strict as proposed. They had expressed concerns that those very prescriptive metrics would make the neighborhood static. They equated it to this paint by numbers approach. And whereas guidelines that are not those prescriptive metrics that are definable as you can't exceed this width and have those very specific numbers that you'd adhere to, they give the board a lot more latitude. And so there's more flexibility there. And so the board was okay with keeping the content of the standards, but not as standards. They were very clear that they did not want them as standards, but would be okay with them as guidelines in the ordinance. Now, this is something that I just want to elaborate on why the standards were proposed, and we feel compelled to explain this again in detail because we got so much community feedback on this, and it was a really important part of the process. So the reason why the standards are proposed in the ordinance is because they are objective, they do provide predictability, and they can avoid a costly and discretionary review process. We wanted it to be transparent for both a developer coming in to know what's expected, but also for the review board to know what the neighborhood had wanted. And throughout our entire process of years of review and community feedback, we heard that quality of design is just paramount. It is super important. We heard that in the first phase of the vision plan, but specifically why we went through developing this ordinance. And I think the third bullet's really the most important, and that's that the standards are very clearly reflective of the neighborhood's preferences. And the general community character along the corridor is what we heard again and again that folks really liked. And that's what we're trying to maintain with those standards. And the concept of design standards, it was just vetted through numerous forums and numerous working group meetings and conversations that we've had with members of the public throughout this process. And so again, we just want to respond to this and hear the planning board's concerns, but staff took an approach to just comment on each one of those. So there are concerns of the cookie cutter design or the paint by numbers approach. And our response to that would be the standards were really specifically created to encourage a wide range of development. If a dormer is proposed, it would need to meet the metrics, but it doesn't require a dormer. And so it's not saying that you have to build this way, but if you put these elements in there, they'd have to fit. And those are clear standards that fit in with the neighborhood. So a couple of examples that are included. There's a range of roof styles that are allowed by right. And every single roof style that's proposed is currently found along Bridge Street Neck today. The building components, again, all of those are found today. The specific dimensional requirements just help ensure high quality. So if you think about, again, that dormer example, what we've heard is there could be a dormer added that's just huge and out of context and out of scale with the building, but having those specific metrics help define to make sure that it will be in scale, particularly if the project is not meeting a site plan review threshold. We can make sure that it's still meeting the vision in those design standards. Glazing requirements is another one. There was just a very clear preference to have glazing or windows on the first floor retail. And that's, again, a best practice as well. And so you see this, and it's just a reflective of best practices. And those are just a few examples, but in all cases, the intent of the standards is to encourage flexibility, but then maintaining that high quality design. There's also a concern expressed by the planning board about the process to change. If we ever wanted to go from design standards and changing those design standards in the future, where design standards don't belong in a zoning ordinance. Oh, sorry about that. Because, we have to go through a zoning amendment every time we want to change that. And while that is true, we actually think that's a good thing, because these design standards went through over 2 years of process and had so much community input. If we're going to change it, it'd probably be a good thing to have to go through that process. And so it might not be, you could look at that as a positive aspect. And then the concern just in general that design standards don't belong in a zoning ordinance. We have seen it's becoming very common for design standards to be included in zoning ordinances. There are communities throughout Massachusetts, but then also national communities too that have design standards. In Massachusetts, there are standards in Situate. Somerville actually took the approach that their entire zoning ordinance is now design standards. So it could be district specific like ours. Some communities have 40R districts, which are very specific, and sometimes even just one parcel with design standards. But it's not a novel approach. It is something that's done throughout the Commonwealth and throughout the nation. So that was just an overview of the design standards and guidelines. And this is really the meatiest one, but I'm interested in your thoughts on this. And if members of the public have comments, we'd love to hear those as well.
Thank you, Amanda. That was a really great recap. Like, as you were going, I wrote questions, and you literally just answered every question I had. So thank you. It was very thorough. I'd like to first open it up to members of the committee and members of the council to see if you had any questions or comments to what in regards to the design standards to guidelines piece that we just went over. Councilor Hapworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Being a member of the committee, I just wanted to also thank Amanda for that portion of the presentation. I think that was very clearly laid out, and really appreciate that. I think the conversation around design guidelines is anybody who's knocked on doors around Salem knows that the average person does not hold significantly NIMBY or YIMBY views around design. The average person in Salem looks at new housing and says, I understand that neighborhoods change and that new people come in and that there may be more density coming in, there may be more people coming into my neighborhoods, and that my neighborhood may shift and change, and that's fine. What I don't like is I don't like every building coming in and looking exactly like something I saw in Nashville or Seattle or wherever, the sort of very generic design. I would love to see things fit in. And I think Bridge Street is a great example of a neighborhood that was built as multifamily, mixed use, working class housing. I think people who live there love that about it. They're not asking to keep people out of their neighborhood. They're not asking to stop construction. They're not asking to stop things from changing. They're just saying that when new things change, when new things come in, we expect that some of these within a wide range of different elements just sort of meets what we have right now within this neighborhood. And this is not, I think there's some concern about this creating a very homogenized, generic neighborhood. This is an overlay. This isn't zoning for all of Bridge Street Neck. This is something a developer can opt into. And in order to take advantage of the increased density and the mixed use components of this, they're going to have to abide by some of the design guidelines that the neighbors are asking for, and that we went through a 2-year process to look at. So I guess for me personally, I'm not a member of the committee, but I would appreciate not making that shift on that language. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Hepworth. Councilor Marcillo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not being a member of the committee, I have a couple of general questions, and hopefully either people on the committee or others that are in the public that are here to speak could help me out here. And that's 2 issues. Why didn't the neighborhood want to create a local historic district to kind of govern these design details and how they want their neighborhood to be preserved? It seems like that's what other historic districts do. So that's one question. And then the other is in 8.7.7, the purpose and overview, it says, and this was an interesting comment, it says, the Bridge Street Neck has experienced almost continuous development over its 3 centuries of existence, resulting in a variety of historic architectural styles present. I thought that was curious that historically styles have changed. This street has seen a whole series of different styles that now they want to preserve, but they want to stop. I guess that's the conundrum, is they want to stop right now and say, okay, we want it to look like the past couple hundred years, but nothing future, nothing new. So that was just kind of, if I could get some context on that. I think that's what I'm struggling with here.
Thanks, Councilor Marcillo. And Chris, I see you have your hand raised, so I'm hoping you'd like to respond to that one. Or
yeah, thanks. I hope that's okay. I'll respond to the second question. I think other people could maybe speak better to the first question about the historic district, but I actually think that the idea of these design standards is actually very specifically not prescriptive of a certain style, whether historic or contemporary. The idea is to ensure that whatever is built still feels like it fits along the corridor. And that can become a wide variety of styles. That's why we allow, for example, 7 different, or whatever it is, different types of roofs. It's not any one single style. It's intended to ensure that whatever is built adheres to certain principles that kind of emerged from the process of what I think we feel like was good design. So I hope that answers that question.
thank you. Councilor Presnitsky?
Thank you, Madam Chair. When the bypass road was built back, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I think anybody with any foresight in the city realized that that's going to change the character of Bridge Street and Bridge Street Neck. It pushed the traffic that used to be on Route 1A on Bridge Street, which used to be a very heavily traffic laden road, business and some houses on it, shifted the traffic over, mostly of it, to the bypass road, which made Bridge Street become a quieter, more conducive properties to build on and live in. I think the people that are living on both sides of Bridge Street, looking forward to the progress being made, that it would be developed into something that would be more quaint and more culturally attuned to Salem's character. This is an opportunity for the city planners and the city council to see that doesn't become a hodgepodge, or it doesn't become, as Councilor Hapworth said, a bunch of Stepford wives' houses, or all in a row either. So I think that the point I'm trying to make is trying to keep the culture of the city, the historic of the culture of the city in the neighborhood, in tune to the further development of that. And I think that's what the residents want to see. It's an opportunity. It's become a nice, much more quiet neighborhood, much more livable neighborhood ever since the bypass road was built. And I think the people are trying to seize the opportunity to keep it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Krasniewski. Councilor Cohen?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. I'm in Ward 5, but I've spent a little bit of time on Bridge Street Neck. And I can remember many times when my wife brought me, I think she's in the meeting, but brought me to some of the beginning meetings. And the public participation, I think, on this project was maybe as good as anything I've witnessed in Salem. And in my thinking about Canal Street, I think about, Bridge Street, Bridge Street Neck. And it does seem to have a theme to it. There are some buildings that are not mixed use, but there are many that have mixed use. And I feel like when I saw the presentation that was done at the last meeting, that there was really a wide spectrum of what people can use for their buildings. And I do think it's very reflective of what the residents intended, or what their desire was. So I do agree that it's expansive enough that it will fit into what people are looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Presnowski, I just want to confirm, are you all set? Okay, thank you. Councilor McLean, if you have not spoken yet.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. Not being a member of the committee, I tend to agree with the planning board's recommendations here. Absent the PUD recommendation, I think that's good to keep a note. I just want to kind of quickly touch on the administrative part, and then I'll speak to the design guidelines as well. But I tend to agree pretty strongly that the administrative review should be removed, and my reasoning is really simple. If I recall correctly, the administrative review is aimed at smaller projects that might not rise to the level of larger reviews, which is fine. But with planning board review, we have sort of a defined and public process that takes place, right? People have an ability to know that something is being considered, to participate, to give feedback. And I think that's really important. I think creating reviews for what can be developed that can just be sort of done administratively, where the public doesn't necessarily have that opportunity to be informed or to have input, is problematic. And to the point of the design standards versus guidelines, I likewise tend to agree that we should be a little bit careful about really baking in hard standards into our zoning. I certainly understand the point that some communities are beginning to explore that, and that is fine. But I think we should be really intentional about that. And I think we should decide whether we want to do that in a comprehensive way, not begin to explore it in overlays in only pockets of the city. And I don't think it I don't think it removes the ability for a developer to sort of come in and have a sense of where they should go, right? There will still be guidelines. They'll still have an ability to say, this is how I should approach this strategically in order to move this project forward. And I think they still will, but I do think we have plenty of examples of zoning playing out over time where you put things in and number one, they're extremely hard to change, right? It's easy to say that we could come back in a future point and, go through the zoning process and the hearing process and change it. But we all know the reality of that. It's really, really difficult to change zoning once it's done. It's not that easy and it takes a long time. And regardless of the intent of the moment right now, we know that right now is only a moment and people in the future may feel different and it's going to be much harder for them to come in and change something once it's been established, right? Creating something from the beginning, you've got a little bit more wiggle room, but even with this overlay that we're considering right now, this is sort of the second crack at the bat to get this thing done. So I think we should really be conscious of that. We should really be careful with that. I think it's good to have some guidelines, but if we were going to put in some really strict standards, I would much rather see that done at a design review board kind of place where we have a one-stop shop that really talks about what we want to do as a city, and we do it there, and we can really make a comprehensive and holistic change to the city, if that's what we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor McLean. Councilor Hepworth, I see your hand is still up as well before we go to the audience.
Yeah, Madam Chair, just really quickly. I just wanted to just highlight a difference between mandating a style versus mandating, I guess, a scale, which I think this does more is mandating the scale of the buildings and what we see here. We're not saying these need to be federal style or they need to be Victorian style or anything along those lines, which is something I would certainly never support, but it's mandating a scale within a neighborhood. And I think it's also important to point out, I think Amanda sort of touched on it a little bit, but this is really our first time as a city that we're sort of dipping our toes into a form-based versus a use-based code. And I think a form-based code is something that neighbors ask for without even knowing they're asking for it, which is to say, like, we just want this stuff to fit in. I don't care how many families are living necessarily next to me. I don't care what you do with your property. I just want to make sure that what we have, as long as it's not hurting my neighborhood, as long as it's not, a chemical waste facility, but we're more concerned with sort of just fitting into the scale of our neighborhood. And I think this is a great first step moving into a more open code that we could potentially look at in the future.
Thank you, Councilor Hepworth. So, Councilor Dominguez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question that I have for Amanda, through you. You mentioned that there's many conversation, many public hearings, many discussion over the last 3 years. Do you have any sense how the entire, some of the neighbors, including some of the working member of the working group, are not in agreement with the recommendation from the planning department? Do you have any sense how the majority of the people are in regard to that decision made by the planning department?
I don't have a percentage of who's not in favor of standards. Chris, I see your hand up. Do you want to take that? I don't recall hearing folks not in support, so.
Yeah, I also don't have a specific percentage, but I will just say, I know Amanda has sort of talked about this in her presentation, and I heard this from at least one of the other city councilors tonight as well, in terms of the process. And I just want to add into that. I've worked at MAPC for about a decade. I've done many projects that are similar to this, and I do believe that this process, starting from the original visioning plan to the ordinance itself, has really been the best and most complete process that of any project that I've worked on as a planner, specifically in the sense that I would say every single aspect of the proposed ordinance as it was submitted was vetted and refined multiple times from the community. I believe we were able to incorporate virtually every single comment we received throughout the process. In some cases, it was maybe a compromise language, but I believe we addressed everything within here. And so I would just say, while I understand the recommended changes by the planning board, other than the clarifying language ones at the end, I disagree with them, not necessarily because I think that they're bad ideas, but actually just because I believe that they go against what has been such a really strong process from the neighborhood. Thanks.
If I may, follow up question in regard to density. Is density is being taken out? I see on the comments that you made that density would not be addressed. Any reason why? Because I think that's one of the topics that I hear when I go to that neighborhood. There's some concern about density.
Sure,
The new change will bring some density.
Sure, Councilor Dominguez, I'll answer that one quickly. So we will definitely be speaking of density this evening. We're just taking the recommendations in piece. So we haven't gotten to the density topic yet, but we will be speaking to that this evening.
Okay.
We're just not there yet. Councilor Watson-Felt?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi, not being a member of the committee. A question for clarification for Councilor Dominguez through you. Councilor Dominguez, you had just said, I just want to make sure I heard the question correctly and that I understood it. The question to Amanda was, do members of the working group have an opinion about the recommendation from the planning department or from the planning board's response?
I see some letter of disagreement in the past from some member of the working group of the recommendation from the planning department. And my question was in regard, and how many do you know, what is the sense of the working group and some of the people opposing that recommendation?
Opposing the overlay that has been put before it?
Opposing the recommendation from planning department, the changes and the thing that they recommend after they voted for. You got it?
Counselor.
So I'll try to answer that. I think that's essentially what we're doing this evening. So we'll go to public comment next and see, because we, as a council, just received their recommendations last month, 2 weeks ago, and now we're meeting for the first time to review their recommendations. So for public comments specifically on the planning board recommendations, which just happened, but there was a whole other public process on the original draft, and it received, a lot of public support of drafted as is. But the feedback to the planning board comments, that's what we're doing this evening. So if there are no other comments from the committee or from the council, I'll go to those public comments. And just for members of the public, if you'd like to speak, please raise your hands and I will allow you to speak by doing a mute, just kind of a recap. So we are kind of taking this piecemeal this evening. So I will go back to the public again on the next topic to kind of keep it flowing. Right now, we're providing comments on the standards versus guidelines design. If for some reason you're just able to speak once and you'd like to get all of your comments out now, that's fine as well. I'm not going to stop you there. But if you are able to join us for the whole fun evening, this is the specific topic that we're talking about right now, is the standards versus guidelines. So I'm going to go in the order that I see. And first it will be Flor Tanta. I'm going to allow you to talk, Flora. If you could please state your name and address for the record.
Flora Tonthat, 30 Northeast Street. I believe we absolutely need standards and not mere guidelines in this overlay to achieve the goals of the look and feel of Bridge Street Neck that the public input gathered and people wanted. And this is so that a building doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, so that we have and it's not cookie cutter, because I feel that standards are not as restrictive as being in a local historic district under the Historic Commission, but it's not as general as guidelines. And the way that it was explained to me, like a guideline would be like a first level shop should have transparency for windows, whereas the standards gives the specific metric range, operative word being like a range of the retail window, or for like, the look and feel that, that the public input have garnered. So that's why it's really important to have standards and not mere guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Flora. Next, I see Drew Nelson. I'm going to allow you to talk. Drew, just unmute yourself, and if you could please state your name and address for the record.
Good evening. This is Drew Nelson. I'm on 102 Bridge Street. And just listening to the counselors speak, I was at some of the town meetings. Ideally, we really want to make certain we have scale, height minimums. Do not want to have this area look like all like Beverly with a huge amount of condo, an apartment complex. That's a big concern. So whether it's the standards versus the guidelines, as a resident that lives on the street, we just want to make certain the look and feel is protected to what we have now, multiple use structures, homes, businesses that, have the right, not a crazy amount of height and not, a proper scale, not colossal apartment blocks. So just want to make certain, however this is, that those kinds of things are protected. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments, Drew. Next up, we have Emily Udi. Emily, I'm going to allow you to speak. If you could please unmute yourself and state your name and address for the record.
Hi, this is Emily Udi, 8 Buffum Street, and speaking on behalf of Historic Salem. Thank you to Councilor Riccardi and the committee for for taking this public comment. As we go through these different comments, I appreciate being able to be involved in the discussion. We did send a pretty thorough letter this afternoon. It was a little later than we anticipated, and I'm not sure if people were able to read that or not, but if you're able to take a look at that, I appreciate your consideration of those comments. I did want to address the question that was asked about local historic districts, because that is something that Historic Salem is very interested in. And that has been a conversation throughout this process the last 3 years, and was called out as a potential option. The larger vision that was established at the beginning of this process lists several tools that could be used to achieve the vision. And one of those is specific historic protections. There was a discussion about including, sort of doing a parallel process with the local historic district paired with this zoning. That was something we would have supported, but I think the city and the working group decided that that might be messy, not messy, just it's sort of hard to do two things at once. So we respect that decision by the working group and the planning department. A local historic district does provide very strict standards, and we, as a nonprofit, are available to discuss with community members what we can do to sort of advocate for that, if that's something that members of the community are interested in doing. I just will restate that that's something we're very interested in. It's not something that is on the table at the moment, so I think that the discussion about guidelines versus standards is pretty important. And I appreciate the community desire to have some say in what the buildings look like. However, that is accomplished, I think is really important for the neighborhood. And then just, I'm curious, are we going to talk about planned unit development later? Okay, great. So I'll hold my comments until then. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for your comments. I I will note too that I hadn't fully read the letter. I just saw it when I started the meeting tonight. So I did forward it to the full council, the public comment from HSI, as well as putting it in our shared drive folder. So we have that to reference as well. I think that's it for public comment on this topic. So back to the council for the item that I guess we kind of need to make some sort of idea on before we go to the next one, because it does kind of base how we decide design standards or guidelines. Will then decide what we need to do with the administrative review discussion, or will then lead us into the administrative review discussion. We can do them parallelly, but it does kind of have an effect on the other. I will make my own comment as a member of OLA that I agree with as it's written, not with the planning board recommendations. I feel like more like a recommendation or a guideline is very hard to be the enforcer of as well. Like, right, just on my own area, I know that NRCC has references in their, it's not necessarily an overlay district, but in their special district, references like recommendations or preferred uses of materials. And it's always a really kind of fine line to enforce a recommendation or to, and the neighbors seem to always kind of be asking for more, where I do wish that there was kind of a more tight following like this. I think I agree with Councillor McLean's notion that this should be citywide. We should be, looking for something. I think it would be kind of impossible to do one design standard citywide, but I love the idea of this, and really adding those additional kind of pieces to help complete our neighborhoods. Councillor Watson-Felt?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. I just wanted to say I agree, and I agree with those that have made comment tonight that the standards are preferred and that we do not accept the planning board's recommendation to change that portion to guidelines for the exact reasons that you cite. I think that the only comment I wanted to add before we move on is, and this hopefully will help transition into the administrative review question, which is that, I think for the small projects particularly, right, where the standards, where we still want to see standards that are measurable and able to be actually measured and implemented through a review process, is important. And the site review process, right, if we were to go away from an administrative review process and move toward the site review process under the design review board, that's a really cumbersome process for small business owners and homeowners. And it requires, it can be very expensive, and it can require the hiring of specialists and all kinds of things. And I think that, and so this idea, because they are connected, right, of measurable standards that could be tracked through a process that is helpful to our residents, through an administrative review process, is better than going away from it for all the reasons you cite, and everyone else has cited, but also because it would be the review process that currently exists otherwise outside of the administrative review would be difficult. I think it would be difficult for the neighbors. And so I hope that's a helpful transition into the next section of the conversation.
It is actually. So I'll put it out to the OLA committee to ask and see if there are any motions on the floor about, because if we agree to recommend to keep the standards in the ordinance, then there would be, or keep it as is, and there would be no motion needed. Or if we wanted to convert them into guidelines as recommended by the planning board, then we would need to have a motion to revise the language there. Councilor Varela, I see your hand went up. I'm not sure when, sorry.
Thank you, Councilor Riccardi. So if you were looking for a motion right now, would you? For me, I would recommend to keep it as is. Okay. Okay.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of confusing. Like, if we want to keep it as is, we don't really need a motion because we're not changing anything. If somebody did want to change it to convert it to guidelines, then we would need a motion to do that. But if there's no further discussion on that or no further motions, then we can transition into the administrative review piece and continue with that conversation there. Are we good with that, or any motions? Okay, great.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen again. So this is the administrative review section. I'm just going to make this box smaller so I can see it. Okay. So if design standards are included, which it sounds like that's the direction, you don't have to stick to it, but that's the direction that the OLA committee is going in. Then the question is, do you want to keep the administrative review? If the design standards were not part of the ordinance and they were just guidelines, you couldn't have an administrative review. It would essentially be moot because staff would need, we wouldn't have anything to measure to, and staff has to have those prescriptive measurements. It can't be discretionary, it would have to be ministerial. And so another option that I could add on the table that I have on the right here too is I hear the concerns with the staff review of the administrative process is having a lower threshold for site plan review, because the concern again is for those small projects that, let's say you just wanted to add a portico to your property. You could, if you require a site plan review for a project like that, that site plan review process requires an environmental impact statement. The property owner is probably going to have to hire an attorney. They have to have a notice in the paper for it. They have to go through a public hearing. It's inexpensive and it is a cumbersome process. The full set of plans for a portico, which has already been vetted by the neighborhood as long as it meets the standards. And so, again, I guess I'll just leave it to you to talk through the administrative review. I do also want to know, I guess, before I turn over to you, the current practice, if a project doesn't require a board review, it just gets a building permit. That is the administrative review. So this just adds on another layer to have staff confirm that the design standards are being met. There's no discretion. It's just looking at, are you meeting the measurable metrics identified in the ordinance? And it's not, again, this is not discretion associated with it. The process that we have currently today is a building inspector signs a building permit because the project is in compliance with the zoning ordinance, the setbacks, the height, that sort of thing. So it just adds that base plus review. So interested in your feedback on this.
Can I repeat that back just to make sure I understand?
Yes.
So there's the base like zoning of setbacks for portico, for example, and in today's process, if the homeowner meets that, they just need to get the building inspector building permit and they can build that.
Correct.
In the process that's being proposed with this ordinance, they need to get, for this said portico, the building inspector permit, and then also this administrative review to make sure that that portico falls within the design standards of the neighborhood, correct? Or this ordinance, sorry.
Yeah, correct. And so when someone applies for a building permit, we have it all online now on something called Viewpoint Cloud or OpenGov. This is permitting system. And what happens is when the application is submitted, staff gets notifications and it's a workflow. And right now the workflow would be the building department. If there was plumbing involved, it'd be, plumbing inspector, that sort of thing. We would add planning department into the workflow. And so it's not a separate process. It's all part of that same building permit. You just add planning into the workflow and we would confirm or review the project for compliance with the design standards. If it meets the design standards, we just check it and it goes to the next item on the workflow. If it does not conform, then the applicant can revise their plans to conform, or they can apply for a waiver and go to the planning board with that waiver.
Thank you. And can you explain to me what the threshold is that it's between administrative review and planning board? Is that project size?
Yeah, it's, gosh, I need to open the ordinance again. Let me pull it up. It's square footage based. It's 2,000 square feet, regardless of number of units. So under today's ordinance, it's 6 units or more, or 2,000 square feet of commercial. The proposed ordinance is 2,000 square feet. So it could be a 2-family home would require a site plan review. And it's new square feet in addition.
And when you say
2,000.
today's ordinance, you mean like the general, that's citywide, anything that's 6,000 square feet or more? Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I feel good about understanding it now. Anybody else on the committee or council have questions or comments? Okay, I'll see if I see that there are still members in the public with their hands up. So it looks like you're still actually able to talk. So I'll just call on you to see if you have comments regarding the administrative review. Flora, did you have comments on this item?
The the administrative review. I mean, I agree that we should keep it simple. I feel like if we make things too complicated, or we make people jump through hoops, that they might just do things, you know, without, just do it illegally, and that would be a bad thing. And if we already have standards and they just have to meet them, that's really easy, and they don't have to, you know, spend more money or, you know, time and, you know, jump through hoops, basically.
Thank you. And Drew Nelson, I see that your hand is still raised as well. So if you would like to add any comments on this topic, feel free.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had done that. I'll lower it. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Thanks. Any other comments from the committee or council? Councilor Dominguez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just quickly, question. The administrative review, according to what Amanda just explained, just add more, but do not have any legal implication in case, for example, I look at it from the point of view of commercial construction developers. I know that for the regular residents might add more cost, but on the other hand, might bring some more quality of construction. And my concern is in regard of any big developers coming and you know, do a project. Do the currently standard that we have feed these big developers as the residents also in the same level?
So the standards apply regardless of the size, as proposed in the ordinance. The standards would apply to any project proposed within the overlay. So whether it's a single family home or a business or a large development, it's just the process would be different depending on the size. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
Let me rephrase my question. Mm-hmm. What was the logic of proposing the administrative review if we had in place a standard process that kind of similar to what they proposed? There is any logic on why it was proposed instead of what we had?
Yeah, so the reason that we proposed to have an administrative review was to make sure that design standards would be met for small projects. It would be a burden to require a site plan review for every single project, again, because it's expensive. It's expensive for a small business owner, for a small property owner, and we didn't want to have that, you know, large project review for just small things that really don't, that if they meet the standards, then it's, you know, you're checking those boxes, they can move forward. It's really not discretionary. I mean, site plan review essentially isn't discretionary either, but the board has flexibility there. So the idea was just if it's a small project to be able to streamline that as long as the project is in compliance with the zoning standards. So it was to try to keep projects affordable and not create that sort of more cumbersome process for a large project. It does lower the threshold for site plan review. Now, again, throughout the rest of the city, site plan review for residential is 6 units or more. And in the ordinance, we're proposing it based on square feet of 2,000 square feet or more. And so, typically you would see a much larger building that would kick in at site plan review. And this does still lower the threshold for planning board. We're just trying to capture those very small items.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll wait and see if there are any other hands. So this item, the administrative review. So as we kept the design standards in, it's kind of a similar question to what I had previously for the committee, that if there are any motions to revise as to how it's written, we can do that now, or if we can keep it in the administrative, or the committee chooses to keep it as drafted, there would be no motion needed, and that would be the 2,000 square feet being the new base for full review, and then all other projects go to the administrative review, which is the new process. And I don't think there are no other zones in the city that follow that process now, correct?
The only other process that goes through, I guess, an administrative review are signs, because we do have a sign ordinance, and it doesn't just get a building permit for a sign. Planning staff reviews it for consistency with the dimensional standards. And then if it's in a commercial court, in an entrance corridor, we review signs for compliance in the commercial corridor guidelines. So that's the equivalent thing that we have in the city to design, to an administrative review.
Great. Thank you. Ms. Nelson, I do see that your hand went back up. So if you'd like to make a public comment, you can do so now. Oh, I went back down. Okay, I think we might be okay to move on to the, Councilor Dominguez, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You mentioned that we had to make a motion to keep it as it is, or to accept the recommendation.
Right, yeah, it's confusing. Yeah, so we would only make a motion if we wanted to change the ordinance that's in front of us.
Oh,
to and kind of accept the planning board recommendation, or if we want to keep it as is and move forward. If we want to keep it as is, we can just move forward with no motion needed. So it sounds like we're moving forward, and the next topic on our docket is planned unit development, which the planning board, I believe, had a recommendation on that as well, to not preclude. Oh, great. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, so this is the only item that we really didn't have a lot of, robust discussions with the community on. When we proposed this ordinance and went through standards and all of these ideas back in August and in the public input site, we had looked at planned unit developments as they would be allowed. And so that means those larger sites that could be transformative in the parcel would be processed that way. They wouldn't be subject to this ordinance. But then, after these meetings that we had discussions with folks that we called them office hours. Through the public input site, you can sign up for office hours. And as Chris mentioned, we made every change in this ordinance that was asked that made sense. And this is one that we felt it did make sense. So the members of the public had said, we really like this ordinance and we want these large transformative parcels to be part of that ordinance. It was questioned, why would you preclude planned unit and why would you allow planned unit developments when these are the properties that are going to have a big impact, and we want to make sure they meet the vision and they meet these design standards. And so added this, or I guess I should say precluded planned unit developments, which essentially just means that those larger sites in the district, which have to be 5 times the size, the minimum lot size, or 60,000 square feet, whichever is less, would have to go through the Bridge Street Net Overlay District instead of having the planned unit development, which is much more flexible. A planned unit development does not have lot area per dwelling unit. So the number of units is determined based on the site. It's a site analysis that the development team puts together, reviewed by the planning board. It wouldn't have design standards or wouldn't even have the design guidelines. The board could point to this, but they wouldn't be required to adhere to any of those things. And so, again, it's something that we haven't tested out with the community. And so we're very interested in hearing your thoughts and public input on this item.
Thanks, Amanda. Any comments from the committee or council? Councilor Marcillo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Amanda. So if the large sites at some point are developed and a PUD is not utilized, would then the pathway be to create subdivisions on that land? Is that what they would do, to create streets and then more single and multi-family housing?
I'm not sure if you could redevelop them as single families. I guess that could be an option. I think what we are envisioning is there'd be a mixed use development. That this ordinance would allow for a multi-scale mixed use development through a planned unit development. So, commercial or retail or whatever that component is, plus residential and some open space, as that's a requirement of a planned unit development. If it went through planned unit development, if it went through this ordinance, it could be any of the uses that are allowed. Mixed use developments allowed, residential is allowed. So.
Thanks. And Chris, I see your hand went up too on that topic. So
yeah, I think it's most likely, regardless, it would be a mixed use type of development. I don't think you would probably see new streets being created. If you look at, in this specific case along Bridge Street, the largest parcel is where the Clipper Ship Inn is. I think that's around 4 to 5 acres. It's not very large. So I think it's likely to be a single development would be what I think would be most likely.
Any other comments on PUDs? Let's see how many times I can say PUD tonight. Oh, sorry, Councilor Hepworth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not being a member of the committee, I just want to voice my own feelings on this, which is that I don't have any issue normally with PUDs within the rest of the city. I've had issues on occasion, but I think in this specific instance, just noting the public input that came into this, the process that we went through here, a PUD would. The ability to have a PUD, which, by the way, just backing up on that, the part of the reason we started this was just the recognition that these sites like the Clipper Ship and Break and Clutch are just these very large sites that have the potential to change the neighborhood dramatically, and they will at some point. They will turn over. We understand that's probably going to happen, but adding a PUD, I think, would negate a lot of the work that the neighborhood put into this entire process here, and I think that. Something I certainly would not support adding this back into this ordinance. Thank you.
Councilor Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. I just want to echo what Councilor Hepworth said. There's only a few areas in the whole overlay that would apply. I think the 99 and Break and Clutch and the Clipper Ship. So I don't think it needs to have a PUD or PUD. Thank you.
Councilor Marcillo, did you have a follow-up question?
I do, actually. Thank you. Amanda, if we can just complete the circle here, what would we be losing without a PUD?
There wouldn't be as much flexibility for those larger properties. In terms of density, if they wanted to exceed, or I guess go lower than whatever the density is in this ordinance, they would need a variance for that. Height, you would need a variance for anyway from a P. So really it's the density. You would lose flexibility in terms of density, and then also you lose flexibility in the design would need to meet. Well, even the design standards, there's so much flexibility already built into this ordinance. So I don't want to say you lose any of that because they could get a waiver from any of the metrics in there. So I think it's just the density. Am I missing anything, Chris?
Okay.
Councilor Marcillo, was there a follow-up to that? No. Okay. And Councilor Hopworth, I see your hand is still up. Did you have a follow-up?
No, Madam Chair, I don't have a fault.
Okay. If no other comments from the committee, I will go to public comment on the PED topic. I believe Emily mentioned earlier that she wants to speak to this. If you want to make a comment, please just raise your hand. Flora, I see your hand is up.
Okay, just a question for Amanda again. If we allow PUD, only the large parcel would qualify, because you can't, I mean, right? And so we're only talking about Clipper Ship 99, Break and Clutch, and the boatyard maybe.
So it does only apply to large properties. A property has to be 5 times the minimum lot size, and most of those properties are around 15,000 square feet minimum lot size, or 60,000 square feet, whichever is less. So it'd be 60,000 square feet in size. A few of the zones have a minimum lot size of 6,000 square feet, so it's a little bit smaller of a threshold. It took a look at it again. I don't think the 99 qualifies. I think it would be, I had an analysis of this, but you know, the boatyard, or that really long, odd property, that has enough. Yeah, so that's large enough for a planned unit development, and the Clipper Ship Inn. So those are the two.
Break and Clutch does not qualify?
I'd have to check the zoning again, but at a quick glance at it, it doesn't look like it.
But no other.
I think it's because the Break and Clutch is actually 2 parcels, and that's why on that analysis it didn't come through as one large parcel.
That's a really good point. So any person can come in and buy up properties. Let's say they bought 5 contiguous properties, and then now you have the minimum lot size. So it depends on how a future property owner would combine them, or Break and Clutch. If that's large enough, put those 2 together under common ownership, then it could potentially be a planned unit development. But again, just in concept of it, think of it as large scale development. I mean, it's between 30 and 60,000 square feet in size. So almost an acre to over an acre.
I see. But if somebody were to come in and buy 5 parcels to make up for that lot size, they have to be connected, right? They have to be, connected to make one. They can't be separated, like have the house in the middle, or separated somehow.
Yeah, they would have to, the properties would have to create that square footage as a contiguous lot.
Okay. And you said if you include the PUD, it would remove the standards from the entire overlay? No, just from that PUD.
Right. So if an applicant came in with if the ordinance is adopted as is, but allows PUDs, and an applicant came in and they decided, I want to go through the planned unit development process instead of the overlay, they can do that, and they would have to meet the guidance of the planned unit development, which has 3 specific findings, but it does not take into consideration any of the findings or criteria or design standards or guidelines in this ordinance. It's a separate ordinance, so you'd be looking at it through a different lane.
Right, but within the Bridge Street Neck district that we're talking about, right now, only the clipper ship and the boatyard qualifies. So if we say we don't want PUD, that means only it would affect them or anybody else who wants to buy up like a number of parcels to make one big lot, right? But if we include the PUD, if we say, yes, you can do PUD, it would only affect Clipper Ship Inn and the boatyard and somebody who wants to come in and buy 5 parcels to connect them into one, correct?
Correct.
Which is highly unlikely, I would think. But it's not impossible, of course. But so that's why I think that the PUD should be allowed because then it would have to go through all the process of, the regular process of design review board and zoning board, that would, and then have, neighborhood input and all that. So, I mean, I understand that we don't want something like a big Walmart with drive-throughs to go into, like, say, Clipper Ship. But, hold on. Like the Halsted at Salem Station at 72 Flint, we do want something like that. So my concern is that if we do not allow for PUDs in these large parcels, we might miss out on well-designed housing that would address the current housing crisis. And I feel like, of course, I would leave it up to you, smart people to figure out how to say what needs to be said. But but also through public input through these processes, we could have them adhere to the overlay for anything that you can see from Bridge Street. But whereas the parcel is so large that it goes behind, it could definitely have a frontage and then tear back or cover by trees or something, and it gives them, the developer, the flexibility that it would need to go through the many thoughtful review board processes, to do, like I said, the Halsted Salem Station is a really nice project, and it's got a lot of housing that is really well designed, and we would love to have something like that. I think. I mean, I would. So I don't feel like allowing PUDs is going to hurt the vision, but it would give the flexibility, but we'll still have many opportunities for public and neighborhood input and the thoughtful processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Flora. I do see there's one more hand up in the public that I'll take public comments from before going back to the council, so we can get all the public comment on the PUD. Barbara Cleary, I see your hand is up on this topic. I'm going to allow you to talk. If you could please state your name and address for the record, please.
Hi, it's Barbara Cleary. Can you hear me? I just unmuted.
Yep, we can hear you.
I see now. It's okay. 104 Federal Street. I'm actually also speaking on behalf of Historic Salem. And this was one of the things that we actually think is very important. The zoning was through the vision, and the actual zoning process was designed to allow development on those large parcels. That's, they can get much more housing than is now allowed. It's mixed use. So there's nothing in the overlay that prevents that development, and in fact, it encourages it. The issue with the PUD is that there are no design standards. you must remember that Stop and Shop over on the Peabody line, that is a PUD. And the neighbors hated that project, but it met the PUD standards and it got approved. So the huge flexibility of a PUD means that the neighbors have no standards to point to. And when we have such flexibility in this zoning ordinance, we think there should not be what essentially is a loophole, which would be doing a PUD. That's how we regard it. So we would really encourage that that not be allowed in this district. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Councillor Watson-Felt, did you have a comment before I ask my question?
I do. Thank you. Not being a member of the committee, but being the Ward 2 City Councilor who also lives in Bridge Street Neck, I can tell you that I have got to echo what Councillor Hopworth pointed out, which is basically to negate the entire work of this group and the design standards that have been requested by the neighborhood if you were to allow the PUD. I think that the overlay is really flexible, as Ms. Cleary just outlined. I think it makes relatively dense housing possible on large parcels, while also including a scale and massing and design control, really, that is reflective and in context for what's there now. I think that, you know, Councillor Hopworth referred to the site sizes of this size as transformative properties. They really are. I think to transform a property, a single property in the Bridge Street Neck neighborhood, which is a relatively small space, to such an extent with so little oversight would be hugely problematic. It is not what the neighbors really want. It is, you know, I just think it would be a huge loophole. So, you know, respectfully, I feel very strongly about this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Watson-Felt. I just had a question. I like to ask my clarification questions as to what this actually means. Again, kind of going back to what Councillor Marcillo asked earlier. So I'm sorry that I'm making you repeat it, but I feel like sometimes it goes around a few times. Excluding the PUD would force those larger parcels to follow this new zoning overlay ordinance, as well as or any underlying ordinance. If we included the use of a PUD, the larger parcel could go the PUD path and therefore would not have to follow the rules of this new ordinance, including these design standards that we just talked about. Is that correct? Did I say that correctly? Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say PUD as many times as I could. Okay. Any other comments from, oh, I see Emily Udi now has her hand up. Emily, if you would like to speak, you please state your name and your comments.
Thank you, Emily Udi, 8 Buffalo Street. My hand went up and down several times because this comment might be more appropriate in the density conversation, but because you're considering PUDs at the moment, I just wanted to, and I was looking through my notes because I have a listing of what the density is for many of the NRCC projects that have been permitted. And I believe that most of them fall around the same density as is proposed in this overlay. So Halsted might not meet the height that is allowed in this overlay, but is a similar density. And, you know, I think the community tends to agree that that's a well-designed project, but it has been zoned under or it was permitted under the NRCC, which is a pretty thorough review process. So using Halsted as an example, I just want to let those who might be concerned about the density and the ability to create housing. And Amanda, I don't know if you can actually confirm or refute what I'm saying, but I do believe that the density there is what is allowed in this overlay.
Thank you, Emily. Councillor Cohen?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. So this has confused me a little bit, so I'm going to also try to clarify things. The Clipper Inn is approximately 4 acres. The portion of the Bertini project that would have housing as proposed is about 4 acres. It's 7 buildings. The 2 buildings on Canal Street, visible to the public, are 3 floors high with a variance from the zoning board because as mixed use, the first floor having proposed commercial retail space would be a little bit higher than a traditional residential. And so they got a variance for that. But the 5 buildings behind it were all more than 3 floors. The proposed development would be 276 workforce rental units. So I'm concerned because if indeed on one side, the PUD doesn't have enough guidelines or requirements, yes. However, if this conforms to the overlay and 3 stories is the maximum, then you could not put a project like the proposed Bertini project on the Clipper. And if that's the case, I'm going to change my mind and vote a PUD be allowed, because as proposed from the renderings, you cannot see the 5 buildings from the street that are behind the 3 buildings on Canal Street. And I feel like it's a very similar goal for the city to have workforce housing, that has at least as proposed, has a really good ratio and percentage of affordability. And, although Canal Street really doesn't have a identity at this point, like Bridge Street Neck, I do feel like it would address the needs. And my biggest concern is that the overlay would limit the amount of affordable housing you could put on the Clipper if that becomes available. So if Amanda, you could clarify that if you cannot do more than 3 floors, and to do 3 floors with mixed use is almost impossible the way it's set up, then I will not vote to exclude a PUD.
Well, I have the floor. I do want to also respond to Emily Udy's comment regarding the units per acre, and the North River Canal Corridor are all right around the density that we're proposing. I have some numbers here that may have been revised. I'm just looking through my emails to try to get the chart. So this is from 2016, and some of them have had amendments since then. But just so you know, the Salem Oil and Grease property that was at 21 units per acre, redeveloped. 28 Goodhue was at 24 units per acre. Again, we're proposing 1,700 square feet per dwelling unit, which is just about 25 units per acre. So those two are less dense than what would be allowed. Riverview Place at 31 units per acre. I believe that's Halstead. In the Gateway Center, which is not built yet, but that was permitted at 23 units per acre. So the density is all right in line about at what would be allowed, and well, what has received variances for in the North River Canal Corridor. And then in terms of height, to go above 3 stories in height, a project would need a variance, just as the Canal Street project that was identified. That project required a variance, I think, for stories and for height. In a planned unit development, you cannot exceed the height of the underlying zoning district, I believe. For a planned unit development, you can have flexibility with parking, with density, but the height has to meet the underlying zoning. So that would require a variance to go over that. So it depends on what that underlying zoning district is.
If I could just follow up, then in that case, if the only way to have the increased height is not to have the PUD, then I'm going back to my original. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is a height variance is an option regardless. So an applicant could apply for a height variance with the planned unit development or with the overlay district. The proposed overlay district does not take away the option to apply for variances, nor does the planned unit development.
So I'm just stating my case here that in that case, then I am going to, I do want to stick with the overlay. And if that gives us the leeway to have either way to have the height variance, because that's the only way that we can get to the potential affordability if such a project as the Bertini project existed, because the Bertini project is way more than 25 or 30 units per acre.
Thank you, Councillor Cohen. Amanda, can you confirm just so the current draft in front of us has a plan unit development excluded? Is that correct? And the planning board, so if we had any motion in front of us, it would be to add that back in or to revise it and add that back in. Okay, I wasn't quite sure which way it was currently written and I didn't have it in front of me. Okay, any other comments or questions on the PUD or any motions from the committee or council or committee, actually, sorry. Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. Not being a member of the committee, I concur with most of the previous comments. I think planned unit development should continue to be excluded from this overlay, but I did just want to make the point that I think the Ward 5 councilors' comments really highlight the difficulty in sort of prioritizing or moving towards a form-based code of organization. And I think there's sort of a counterpoint to the idea that most or many residents are not concerned about density considerations. That has not been my feedback with my constituency. And I think we just really need to keep in mind as we're having all of these conversations that the choices that we're making in this overlay, though we are talking about what neighbors within this section of the city would like to do and what they would like to see, are going to have an impact on development in the balance of the city as well. Depending on what can and cannot go there, because frankly, we're just a land poor community and we just don't have a lot of large parcels that can turn into something. So, I think it's important that we remember that and that we keep that balance, that we want to, of course, allow people the self-determination to set up their neighborhoods in the way that they think makes sense and in the way that speaks to their values. But we also need to really think about how it fits into our overall goal as a city, make sure that we're doing our service for everybody involved, and make sure that we're thinking about what it's going to mean for the neighbors who are here 30, 40, 50 years from now, in addition to the neighbors that are making these choices today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Watson-Felt.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi, not being a member of the committee. Just to respond to a couple points that Councillor McLean just made, I think is a really mindful set of comments, right, about taking a citywide view and the effect that that tonight's conversation and all of our conversations have citywide, even beyond our own neighborhoods. I wanted to say the flip side of that conversation is that this is in large part a response to the pressures, right, of increased density and needing for housing and more development and changing market and everything that we're all experiencing, because it bleeds directly from the downtown. And so there are a series of our neighborhoods, portions of Ward 1, portions of Ward 2, portions of Ward 3 that are really, I think, beginning to feel, and portions of Ward 5 are really beginning to feel this pressure, right? And so I think it's important that we take some kind of form-based action, right, that gives us some sense of standardization around stemming the tide of this a little bit, because it's happening more quickly than we can ensure vision for. And so it's happening around us all the time. And so in allowing for some neighbors, and I want to acknowledge your point about, this outliving some of the neighbors that are there now who are being a part of the conversation. Then some of the neighbors that are here now have been here for 50 years and longer, right? Or they are multi-generational in that neighborhood. They are also brand new from outside of Salem who have moved into the neighborhood and agree that change is happening at a pace without strong citywide vision for it. And so I think it's important to also acknowledge that this public process that incorporated so much input from the neighbors in that area is in response, right, to the pressures that we're all feeling and our changing neighborhoods. And so I just wanted to offer that as additional context to the points you made, which I thought were really valid and mindful points. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dominguez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also had to concur with some of the comments in where I believe that, the drafted plan was already to support the vision or the initiative that is being drafted. So I think that we don't need to have the PDU. And to Councilor McLean's point, I believe that every neighborhood, had their own working group in order to allow or not to allow what they wanted to see in the neighborhood. And I think this is a reflection of many conversations like we mentioned before. I think that we need to honor the neighborhood input and their desire on what they wanted to see. Going back to the PDU, based on what I hear and what I see, I don't see that it's necessary to have it. So I would like to make a motion, if I may, to keep it out of the recommended proposal from the planning department and not to allow to have PDU. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councilor Dominguez. So since the draft that's in front of us has it excluded, am I saying this correctly? Then we're good with, we can move on to the next topic. We don't need to make a motion to include it in. So thank you. So next topic, unless if any other comments on the PUD, sounds like we're good to move forward.
Okay, the next topic is the design review board discussion. In the proposed ordinance, it includes a design standard waiver option. So again, all those standards can be waived through a special permit, but as part of that waiver process, it requires a positive recommendation from the DRB. So think of it essentially as it requires approval from the DRB and the planning board, and they each have their own criteria that they're looking at. The planning board recommended that the DRB only be advisory. So if design standards are included, then this is a topic which it sounds like, again, that's the direction we're going in. This is a topic for discussion. Should the design review board recommendation be advisory as recommended by the planning board, or required as approval as recommended in the ordinance? And now I know this is kind of confusing, so I just want to try to separate it out. If a project is proposed that does not include a waiver and they're just meeting the standards, then that project gets a recommendation from the DRB that's advisory. So it's advisory as long as they meet the standards. If a project does not meet the standards and asks for the waiver, the ordinance proposes a required approval of the DRB. And I can try to clarify that further if you'd like.
One clarification question I have on that, or additional clarifying point, can you add at what point is the trigger for the design review board review?
Thank you. The design review board is required for site plan review. So if a project requires site plan review from the planning board, it automatically requires design review board. So it would only not be included for the administrative review that's less It's actually less than 2,000 square feet. So 2,000 square feet and more gets design review board.
And the 2,000 square feet or more gets the design review board whether or not the standards are met?
Correct. Whether or not the standards are met, it will have design review board review. It's advisory if the standards are met. It becomes a requirement if the standards are not met. A required approval. I shouldn't say requirement. It becomes an approval process if they are not met. And the idea there is to make sure the design review board has to find, so it's a finding because it's a special permit, that the waiver from the standards is still conforming with the overall vision. So we want to create flexibility. We know that we can't contemplate every single design option. So it's okay if a project varies from the design standard as long as you're meeting that overall vision of the ordinance.
Thank you. I have comments, but I will wait. Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi, not being a member of the committee. Another clarifying question, which is, so if a project goes to site plan review and the design standards are met, then by nature, the DRB opinion is advisory, if I understand that correctly. If the standards are not met as currently proposed, then the DRB finding would be binding. Is there any possible configuration where a project could go to site plan review, not meet the standards that are included in the overlay? Do we still have the option of reducing the DRB's opinion to advisory in that configuration? And if so, then what happens? Does it ultimately just remain up to the site plan process as to what comes out of it?
Correct. Yeah, you could do that. And that is the process in the North River Canal Corridor. The design review board is advisory to the planning board. The planning board does not have to accept it. And there have been projects where the planning board has not accepted the design review board's recommendation. It's very rare, but it has happened and it can happen.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just add a comment to that because I'm very familiar with the process of this rarity that might happen, because when it does happen, it's a pickle. I understand though why it happens. They're essentially two separate boards with two, there are, I believe each board has a member, or there's one member that's on both boards, but they're essentially two different bodies of people with two different opinions. There was a project that I watched very closely in the NRCC that those two visions were very different, and the iterations of the project, one was requesting it to go in one direction and one board was requesting them to go in another direction. Eventually, I think the project fell in a good spot, but neither one would have, like the DRB didn't have a positive recommendation, and I don't think that they would have if they were meeting with the planning board. It was just to get those two to meld up sometimes can be very difficult to putting it in like as a hard requirement. I think having it there, it's good to have that process and have it work out and have those two conversations, and they are needed and very much improve the process as a whole. But it could also totally kill a project by the amount of back and forth and just, I don't know. I feel like it was quite hard watching the few projects that this happened to, and quite frustrating. That I agree with the planning board here that it should be advisory versus a requirement. I think that that's their recommendation. Councilor Marcillo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Amanda. When you have those kinds of situations where the two boards just can't seem to agree on what the vision should be for the project, is that because of a problem with the zoning is that a problem with what's specified for that area?
I don't think that's a zoning. This is just, I personally don't think it's a zoning. I think it's more of a, I don't want to, I guess I don't really want to speak to that. I'm not sure why they have that difference, but it's not that one board is saying zoning says this, we need to do that. And the other board is saying, no, we want to go in a different direction. I think it's just.
But the DRB would be utilizing these design standards from the Bridge Street overlay, right? So I don't know.
Can I share my screen again? I want to bring to that the review criteria, because I think that might be helpful here. So this is for, again, when there's that special permit, the design standard waiver special permit. And so this is saying in lieu of the special permit findings in 9.4, that's when, you know, the zoning board has a special permit, there are specific findings. In lieu of those, these are the findings, the criteria that they have to meet. So design review board has to make a positive recommendation that the deviations from standards and guidelines contained herein would improve the overall design of the proposed project. That's their task. Does that improve the overall design of the proposed project? It's pretty broad, and we wanted to keep it broad to give them that flexibility because they are just experts in that field and can speak to the design. The planning board has to find that the overall design would be in compliance with the intent and purpose of the vision update plan, and that strict adherence to the guidelines. Oh, I just deleted a section by mistake. Purpose, but the strict adherence to the guidelines is not in compliance, and so that they couldn't get. This meets the intent. So planning board is looking at that overall vision. Design review board's looking at the design of that proposed project. So it is separate lanes, and at the end they need to meld together. You have to have good design, and we still want the project to be in compliance with the intent and purpose of the vision here.
Chris, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe just trying to think through an example might be if a developer, so there are allowed what we're calling building components within as part of the design standards. And so there's a list of them, and the components that are allowed are things that are found along the corridor today. It could be reasonable that a developer decides they want to build something that's not there. I don't know, let's say a turret for something, okay? Because that's not allowed, they would have to apply for a design waiver. And now the onus is on them to show why having this turret is a positive for the neighborhood from a design perspective. And I guess the question to me, and I don't personally know the answer to this, is which body do you feel is more equipped to assess whether that specific design deviation is a good design and would contribute to the neighborhood corridor? Because ultimately it sounds like it's either the designer board, the DRB, that would make that decision, or the planning board.
Can I ask a clarification question? So the DRB, it's the full DRB process though, or are they just specifically on projects that trigger the site plan review and the full process? Are they having like I don't know if a full DRB review is the correct term, or are they just specifically voting on that one item as to whether or not the standards are met or reasonably fit in?
So the DRB is responding, the criteria review is specifically to what's being waived, but part of their review is the whole project. Like any site plan review, they'd be reviewing the project as a whole, so they can give recommendations to everything else, but that item has to be specific to that standard.
So a follow-up to that. So it's just this one specific, do they submit multiple recommendations back? So it will just be that their response on that one item has to be positive. It doesn't have to be positive as an overall. in the review of their project?
Yeah, the way that's a great question. And we should clarify that in the ordinance, because the way that I had wrote this, I was thinking, maybe that's not clear, and that's why we need to fine tune it. But the way I was thinking this is the design review board provides a recommendation on the whole project, but that criteria, that specific review is just on the standard, what is being waived. So if the waiver is for this one design element, or you want to have a larger dormer than what's allowed. So it would be identifying, just like you do with a variance, all the things that don't comply and why you're meeting your findings, your criteria for those things.
Councillor Watson-Felt.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi, not being a member of the committee. Through you to Amanda. Are you able to speak, and you may not be able to answer this question, I understand that. Are you able to speak a little bit more about why the planning board would prefer the recommendation be considered advisory versus a required element to their decision making? I understand the scenarios, that Councilor Riccardi laid out, but I also understand, I very much feel aligned with the way that Councilor Riccardi sort of expressed this challenge earlier. I've also watched a number of cases really closely where it does get to be a little hairy and can be really challenging, especially for the developer on the other end. But aside from that, the input by the DRB, especially about these specific things that are outside of the standard, I would think they would really value, and especially from an accountability perspective with regards to the public process, it's sometimes nice to share that decision making to a point. So I'm curious if you can speak at all more about why not a required positive recommendation?
I don't recall the planning board's explanation on that. They may have had one and I just am not remembering it.
Me either.
So I don't want to speak to that, but I do want to say the planning board very much values the design review board's recommendation, and so much so that it was because of the planning board pushed to have the design review board have more purview. And now every project in an entrance corridor requires a design review board after certain thresholds. And that's because of the planning board. So why advisory rather than required? And unfortunately, I just don't want to speak to that because I'm not sure.
That's fair. I knew I was kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, but I really am also, I don't know that I entirely get it either. Thanks.
I'll throw it out to public comment. If there's anyone on public comment that would like to make a comment on the design review process, please raise your hand. While we're waiting to see if anyone wants to make comment on this, just another clarifying to set our heads back into ordinance review mode. The current draft that's in front of us has the design standards. So then there would have to be a waiver, and the waiver requires a positive recommendation on that item from the DRB. That's the current draft. Okay. Doesn't look like there's any public comment on this. Are there any motions from the committee to revise that current requirement, or as the ordinance is currently drafted, that a positive recommendation from the DRB is required if a waiver is requested on the design standards? Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. Not being a member of the committee, I tend to concur with the recommendation of the planning board that this should be advisory, and my rationale is this. I think the design review board has, by nature, a little bit more of a narrow focus of concern. Right, their area of concern is really about the impact of design and how that has an impact on the neighborhood and on the character of the city. And I think the planning board has the ability, at least as I read the ordinance as it's written, they have the ability to consider the intent and purpose of this ordinance as a whole. And the scope of the ordinance as a whole is not just design. I mean, it's an important part of it, but you can see right in the first section of the ordinance, there are multiple items that the planning board is going to be considering when it comes to having a good local business district, when it comes to the kinds of development they want, sidewalk amenities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, the design review board has to make a choice about whether they think sort of a design is going to be good or bad, to grossly oversimplify. I think the planning board has the ability to say, maybe this design isn't ideal, but it's worth the compromise in order to serve some of these other items that we want to see accomplished within this district. And in that light, I think they should kind of get the final say. I mean, I think they have the more comprehensive bucket of considerations, and they should be able to say at the end of the day, okay, we understand maybe this design is not quite to the T, but we feel like losing these one or two items is worth it because it's really going to serve the district and it's really going to serve what we're trying to accomplish with the overlay. That's just my interpretation, not on the planning board.
Thank you, Councillor McLean. Councillor Varela?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. I'd like to make a motion.
Okay.
I'd like to make a motion that we accept the planning board's recommendation that DRB become advisory to this process.
Second that.
Councillor Varela makes a motion that the DRB waiver special permit criteria, section 8.7.14, number 1, design review board makes a positive recommendation that we change that to Amanda, do you have actually, sorry, as I'm trying to edit on the fly, you probably have this ready to go, correct?
Yeah, so you would just change that to an advisory recommendation. And then also 8.7.17 would need to be changed. And there it says action shall not be taken for any site plan review until it has received a positive recommendation from the design review board. So that could just state a recommendation from the design review board. And that's under the action of the waiver.
Thank you. So the actual language currently says the design review board makes a positive recommendation that the deviations from the standards and guidelines contained herein would improve the overall design of the proposed project. And we're basically just removing, or Councillor Varela's motion is to change the word positive to advisory in that section. And then in the section 8.7.17, the design review's recommendation shall state the applicable standards, whether the alternative design approach meets the design guidelines, and if a waiver is recommended. Is that the section down there?
Yep, just above that section, right, so 8.7.17, before you get to the number, it says action shall not be taken on any plan for a site plan review until it has received a, and then you can strike positive.
Okay. Did everyone get that, or would you like me to share my screen to see the changes? Are we good? Okay. So we're basically changing one word positive to advisory and removing the word positive. Sorry, my screen got smaller. 1 second. Any further discussion on this item before we go for a committee vote? Okay. Councillor Cohen?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yes.
Councillor Dominguez,
Yes.
Councillor Presnewski,
Yes.
Councillor Varela,
Yes.
and myself is a yes. Okay, that one carries. So we can move on to the next item, which coming up on 8. We might make it. We'll see. Density.
The next item is, yes, regarding density. The planning board recommended for a lower lot area per dwelling unit, which means higher density. The planning board explained that more density is recommended to encourage small units, naturally occurring affordable units rather than those larger units, encourage walkability. And they also reacted to the images that we showed on the screen of examples of 1,700 square feet per dwelling unit, and saw that those are really large buildings on small lots, and these are really large buildings, but they only have 2 units in them, and those buildings could have more than that. And so I had recommended lowering that. Oh, I'm having a hard time moving this. Here we go. And typically in planning, we tend to support higher density for the reasons that the planning board had noted, and those naturally occurring affordable units and smaller projects, walkability. Those are all planning practices that you get from denser development. In this case, though, we do want to respond to the reason that the 1,700 square feet per dwelling unit was proposed. And it really was this community process that we keep going back to. Now, back in August, we had these 2 community forums, and on our public input site, we asked for feedback on density. And we had initially proposed 15 units per acre. Right now, we're proposing about 25 units per acre. The reason we increased it is because we heard members of the public say the 15 isn't dense enough. You can go denser than that. We want this walkable environment. And the examples that we showed, they were really big buildings with only 1 unit or 2 units in them. So similar thinking to the planning board, but at a different scale. The 25 units per acre, though, that is pretty much smack in the middle of the median density of the neighborhood. We looked through all the existing residential development to identify what's currently there, because we keep hearing people like what's there. They like their neighborhood. And so we're trying to get that middle ground. 1,700 square feet is the median density right along the corridor. And that's where, it really was a thoughtful process that got to that 1,700. And again, as planners, we normally would say, yes, that's okay, go denser, but here, it seems like that was very supported by the neighborhood. So I think it'd be really important to get community input and buy-in on going denser than that. So staff doesn't want to provide a recommendation on going denser than that without hearing from members of the public and Ola.
Thank you, Amanda. So Councilor Marcillo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My only comment with that, and this is my fear, is that we're talking about new building here along that corridor. And that's going to, my fear is that new building and new housing units there using this density is not going to bring much in the way of affordability at all. In fact, it will bring the opposite. And I think that's what the planning board also was kind of hinting at, is that we need smaller units in new development, because new development is just so expensive in itself. And we're not going to get, it doesn't seem like we're going to get a whole lot of workforce housing at this density level. That's just that's my comment, but I'm curious what other people are thinking.
Councilor Dominguez? Councilor Dominguez, you're on mute.
Thank you, Madam President. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I will say that we had to be very careful on the density aspect, because density not only bring more construction where we need more housing. I totally agree with that. But we also have to look at the implication that density bring. If we overcrowd one portion of the city, that will reflect on the entire city. By having a bigger density than what it is, I think that the recommendation of the planning department, the density component, like Amanda says, is good enough to go ahead and start the process of creating more housing. I'm not in favor of increasing the density component because it will destroy some of the character of the neighborhood community aspect that we will have in place. I mean, we hear Councilor Pronowski, where I tend to agree with him, that we have to be very careful not creating a area in the city where neighborhood are positive, having quality of life. A big density create some impact on the entire neighborhood that might destroy some of the character that we have. So we have to be very careful. If 1,700, as is proposed, is enough, I'd rather stay with that recommendation other than increasing. So my point is that let's leave it that. Let's take that recommendation and make sure that we really watch the other components of growth, which are in fact sometimes impacting other people's quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Dominguez. Councilor Cohen?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. I respectfully disagree. My property is 5,000, probably 6,000 square feet. And it's a 4-family. And so that's, probably closer to 1,350, 1,400. But when we talked earlier about how we can get the larger units to, the larger lot sizes like the Clipper Inn to something like workforce housing or the Bertini project. The only way to do it is to go through a process with a ZBA and other boards are involved. And it would require, height variances and other things, but if we're really interested and concerned about the lack of affordable housing in Salem, we really have to reevaluate. I'm going to go back to the Bertini project. This is a project that, as proposed, if it is able to happen, will be 20% at 60% AMI. Although they're considering some changes, mostly studio, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom. And the developer has agreed to look at some larger units per Councilor Marcillo's, suggestion. However, to get to that point, they have to go through virtually every board in Salem. And there's going to be plenty of, meetings. And, this fear that we have of density, as if we're this incredibly dense community. I mean, Ward 5 is a pretty congested ward. It's not all multifamily, but there's a large amount, especially in the neighborhood I live in. And I'm just thinking of the fire tonight. This is a fire that is affecting 4 or more multifamilies where a sizable amount of people are being displaced. And what are they going to do for housing? I mean, does anyone here think that anyone who is displaced from the building, the main building that caught on fire, are going to be able to live in Salem? So I'm just suggesting that just because we change the square footage per unit is not by itself going to create more density. And until we have a discussion where we're not using words like density and development as if they're bad words, we're not going to get to where we need to get to. And that is a place where we have more affordable housing for the people who are being priced out of Salem today. And we're just not doing enough. So I'm of the opinion that the square footage is maybe a little bit more than I would like to see. And that's it, because I see other hands.
Thank you, Councillor Cohen. Councillor Hepworth?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm going to just agree and disagree with both of the previous comments that we had. I think around density, I just feel like I just should point out, just at least from my perspective, that density is people, and people add character. And I tend to think that density is a great thing across the board for most of our neighborhoods. And I appreciate density. I know that not all feel that way. I understand that. But generally, density is something that we do need to make sure that this is not a bad word. This is not a dirty word. This is one of the reasons that we all love living in Salem. But I will say that this specific situation where we have a public process that went on for years and years, the change to density here, whether we agree with it or disagree with it, is significant enough that I would feel uncomfortable voting for that sort of a change in this ordinance, knowing that this was pretty clear and consistent feedback from the neighborhood that this is something they wanted. I don't necessarily agree with it. I think that in my opinion, density is generally a positive for our neighborhoods. But I think in this situation, I would feel very uncomfortable voting to change something that was part of a public process that was this intense. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hepworth. Councillor McLean?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. Through you to Amanda, I was hoping to ask if there was more specific information about that 48% of the neighborhood, which is already over the suggested density level here. I mean, I think we tend to talk about median lot size. I tend to look more at the mode, right? When I look at that information that you shared with us a minute ago, what I saw was that 48% of the locations are already above the suggested density, and that's more than double any of the other slices of the pie. So I don't see increasing the density as making some sort of fundamental change to what exists in the district that's already lower than most of what exists in the district. And if we set the density at that level, the impact over time will be to reduce the average density because you're coming in at a lower level. So I think the issue I have, though, is that the planning board, at least from what I'm seeing here, didn't actually recommend a number. And I don't think that we can just say, well, throw it out with no ceiling and, just go for it, right? We need to have some sort of target. So I'm curious if there's more information about what is really happening in that section of the pie, what is really composing that 48%.
So there is, I think it might be helpful to share the map. So I'm going to pull up that joint public hearing map so you can see the lots. And there's not a lot of, so on the map, you'll see there's a lot of white, and those are non-residential. And where you see the darker color, it'd be helpful if I shared my screen. Okay. So here's the existing built environment. In the dark purple, the darkest purple here and here, you'll see is the greater than 1,700 square feet, and it gets denser as you go lighter. And so in the non-residential lots are the tan. So you can see where the denser development is, which on this map it's actually the lighter colors, because that's 1,000 or 1 to 99. So it's definitely a mix, but a key reason you see a smaller lot area per dwelling unit is because these lots are small. They're, many of them are 5,000 square feet. And they have homes that were built many, many years ago with 2 and 3 family homes. And so it's not a lot of units. It's just that the lots are just very small. And then there's a recent development. I think it's these two here that are maybe 40 or 50 units per acre. That's the old Magic Muffler site. That was a lot denser. But yeah, even some of these tiny little lots are equivalent to that at that higher density. But this just gives you a picture if you can think about Bridge Street Neck to orient you and see what it currently looks like. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I think that is helpful. It just seems to me that this could be denser than proposed and still fall squarely within what exists in the district right now. I think I agree with some of the earlier comments. This question of density and, you know, are we doing something that's going to disrupt the character of the corridor? Are we going to end up like Rantoul Street? I just don't see that in the numbers here at all.
Thank you. Councillor Watson-Felt.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi, not being a member of the committee. I think part of the conversation around this, right, I think is about those standards and the design expectations and vision for the neighborhood. I think the increased density, much beyond what's currently there now, makes those standards really difficult to see and realize, because the increased density will require additional space use, right? And so I think part of that conversation is like, if we have the standards and we say this is what we want our neighborhood to look like, you know, with a few really transformative exceptions, I think that it makes more increased density than what's being offered really difficult. It becomes basically just a pickle, right? Because then you have like these maximized spaces. People are asking for 10 to 15 to 20 foot variances to meet the density that's allowed. And so before you know it, I personally feel, I understand the call for more density, right? I do. And I think you make a good point about what's already in the neighborhood. But I do think that the design standards become difficult to enforce when we increase the density, because they just don't match. You can't have buildings with that level of density that fit into the standards that are being recommended. Not that you can't, but it's difficult to do. A couple additional points. I think that the Magic Muffler site kind of proves, by the way, that just because you increase density doesn't mean you get affordability, right? Because those units weren't, and they are relatively dense mathematically. So I think that's why we need things that require affordability, because it's not a requirement. You know, Councillor Cohen wants to point to the development off Canal Street, and that's very much because the developer in that instance looked at that size and scale and thought this is possible, right? So I think that more affordability would have been great to have at the Magic Muffler site at 40 units or 50 units per square.
Uh-oh.
It was that Amanda just quoted, but plenty of calls and mixed messages across these conversations with council around the size of units being either, you know, we need 1 bedrooms. Well, then there are different conversations that say we need 2 and 3 bedrooms because people need to downsize and people aren't selling their houses because the units are too small. So I've heard this council say things on both sides. And I think, you know, maybe all are true, but I think that for this specific conversation, I think that I echo again, that this was done because it is a reflection of the median of what is there now. And it was done through a robust public engagement process. And it is reflective of that process. And to make recommendations outside of that public process that disregard that public process and also could potentially call into question those standards that everyone accepts as being desired is counterintuitive. So, I mean, again, not being a member of the committee, and respectfully, my position would be the recommended density should move forward as a. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Marcillo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, I guess we're here because we're supposed to be keeping the whole city in mind. So I agree with the public process, and I appreciate the public process. But we need to vote on this, right? And we need to use our experience and our view of the city to make sure that what we're doing is correct. Otherwise, why are we here? We could just let the Bridge Street Neighborhood Association write their own ordinance and put it through. So that's just to reply on the public process. We still have time to get input on density from the public in that neighborhood. My question is, how did we arrive at the current number as it's written in the ordinance? What kind of discussion was there around the number of units per lot? You know, I really do feel like we might be putting ourselves in a position where anything that's built that's new is not affordable, and we're actually gentrifying the entire neighborhood, and we're not going to get workforce housing or affordability at all. And the difference is that it's a house lot, right? Like, we can't put standards of affordability on a house lot like we can on a huge project like the Bertini's lot, where they're building lots and lots and lots of units and can build in the affordability. So I think that's where I'm struggling right here. You could take a large house size and instead of it being 2 units, it could be 4 units, and it would still fit in the same square footage. And this neighborhood is so walkable to the train. It feels like, I just want to make sure we're doing the right thing. That's all. There's a lot of questions I have about the density. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Cohen?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. So I wasn't basing my thoughts just on the Bertini project. I mean, I like it because it's a very unique project that potentially will all offer a lot of rental units, and we have a very significantly diminishing rental stock. In my mind, it's the biggest crisis we have in Salem. And yeah, this is new, but you know, we didn't have this issue 20 years ago. And you know, Councilor Dominguez talked about the character of our city. And in my mind, the way we're going to lose the character of our city is for people at lower incomes, working class families are going to be moving out. They are moving out at a pace that we're not correcting fast enough, okay? And so this isn't really just about density. I mean, just to go back to my property, I have 2 1-bedrooms. One is 900 square feet and another is 1,200 square feet. And every time someone has looked at it, they thought it was a 2-bedroom, each one of them. And I guess, you know, back when inclusionary zoning was in front of the council, I remember Amanda bringing up these statistics that were upside down, that we don't have enough smaller units to reflect the need, that our need is in smaller units in general. And I'm just talking about something, maybe reinforcing what Councilor Marcillo said, that we really just need to look at the world the way it is today and try to figure out how we can get to a place where we need to get to. And, you know, in my mind, that place is to enable units. I'm not suggesting that we, you know, adversely affect the character of Bridge Street Neck. I don't think that a couple of 100 square feet per unit is going to do that, but a couple of 100 square feet per unit might make for a few more housing units. And, you know, this is really about mathematics. The only reason that a Bertini project can have the kind of affordability is because of some of the subsidies that they can include, you know, where people can use subsidies, and because of some of the variances that they're going to get. And as I said in the beginning, I'm not suggesting that anyone build a Bertini project with a clipper in is without the required, variances or approval by the city boards that are necessary. I just feel like we really need to start using the prism of what too many people in Salem are experiencing right now and what is happening. It's happening, just everyone lives on a street where people have been displaced because they can't afford to live in their street in Salem anymore.
Thank you, Councillor Cohen. Councillor Dominguez?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just for the record, if I express the character of the city, I mean the character of the neighborhood, just in case it was misunderstood. I also wanted to make clear or reassure that density doesn't mean affordability, doesn't mean low income housing. Density, I repeat myself, that will bring some implication that sometimes do not target the necessity of what we are proposing for. So my only concern is that we need to be careful when we go over the limit and not listen to the expert on things that is happening in some other towns and communities, cities and towns. We need housing. Don't get me wrong, I'm one of the most advocated that we need housing. But we need to do it right. We need to do it in a way that we continue to grow and we not bring more implication of what we have. If we had a recommendation that we already hear from Amanda, that 17 is the number that we have to take a look. Adding more of that is not honoring what is happening in the vision that is being proposed from the neighborhood who has been very, very involved, and we had to honor them. We don't want it to create a situation where we, at maybe 10 years from now, we allowed to have the most density possible and then create an issue where what we're trying to do now is being watched by the implication that we're going to bring with a density component that will not really fit some of the need that we have in terms of housing. Because density doesn't mean that would be affordable. Density doesn't mean that we're going to have more housing appropriated for the need that we had in Salem. That was my comment beside that. I'm in full agreement that we need to target the housing crisis that we have here, but we have to be smart and we have to be very careful on how we move in order for us to not only create more housing, but also continue to grow, continue to have the quality of life that everybody deserves, continue to maintain the growth that we wanted to see, especially in that area. We wanted to see something that happened that everybody agreed that we are in a process of bringing something that continued the positive growth that we haven't seen since we had some change over there. So now we're proposing a new change that is being robust conversation from the community, and everybody agreed that we had to honor them. Now let's be careful on how we, at the end, increase some of the component that might be a little bit too much to change completely drastically some other components of the neighborhood. That was my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dominguez. Councillor McLean?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. Through you to Amanda again. My understanding was that the initial proposal from planning was for lower density, and that it was the neighborhood who said we can have more density in here. I mean, am I misunderstanding that?
You're not misunderstanding that. That's exactly what happened. We proposed 15 units per acre, and the neighborhood said that's not dense enough. We want something that matches our neighborhood closer. You can have more units than that. And so then we proposed the 1,700 square feet per dwelling unit. lot area per dwelling unit. And before we posted, before we submitted the ordinance to City Council, we posted it on our public input site. We vetted it through our working group and tried to get distributed out. We didn't do another survey as we did initially. So, you know, the folks who did, we tried to push it out as much as we could to say, this is a change. This is a key change. We want you to be aware of it. We're proposing more density because that's what we heard from you. And we haven't heard folks say that they're not in support of that. We just heard them say that we want it to be closer to our neighborhood. So that's really where we got to that 1,700 square feet per lot area per dwelling unit. So we haven't tested out a density greater than that. It's not that I don't think it's that the community doesn't support it, it's that we haven't tested it. And another key reason why we were looking at that median is we were trying to find something that would fit within the standards, within 3 stories, within the height, within the setbacks and open space. And it would be really challenging to get greater density at 17 within all those standards, with the exception of perhaps the larger lots. If you don't have a planned unit development, as I'm thinking through this, those lots may be able to somehow get more density within those restrictions, but that's just me thinking about it without running in-depth calculation. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. I do see we have a member of the public up, but before that, I'll go to Councillor Watson-Felt.
Sorry, this is a clarification question, Councillor Riccardi, so thank you, Chair, for recognizing. Through you to Amanda, could we review again some of what I think has already come up in tonight's conversation? So the Halsted is currently a fewer units, right, than what is currently being suggested for Bridge Street. Right, I think earlier in the conversation, you looked it up and it was like Halsted was like 22 or 23 units, and Bridge Street works out to being at about 25 units per acre.
Yeah.
And this density would put, and if I remember correctly, and please tell me if I'm wrong on this, at 25 units per acre, that's already above almost any neighborhood or almost any neighborhood outside of the downtown. Is that right?
Outside of the downtown, that's right.
And what was the number again around the Magic Muffler property again? You said that the Magic Muffler property that is now all residential is, did you say 40 to 50?
Yeah, it was somewhere between 40 to 50. I wish I pulled these numbers up. We went through all of these with our working group because they asked all these same questions.
Right.
These are really great questions to ask.
Right. I think one of the things I remember from our public process that I found, and I think that the neighbors found really, really helpful, Amanda, was when you gave visual examples of what density looks like in Bridge Street next. And that is how I think in part people thought, oh yeah, we could go a little higher than that because look at this, right? Look at this building. We're okay with this building. We're okay with that building. Like that building fits. It kind of fits what we want. So just since this is a numbers game and we're talking about it, and by the way, density does not equal affordability, as has been made clear already in the already relatively highly dense Bridge Street Neck Neighborhood Association or neighborhood. I just wanted to highlight those numbers again. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Watson-Felt. So I am going to open it up to public comments as our patient members of the that have been, if any of you that have logged in that would like to make public comment on the density matter, please raise your hand. I see Emily, your hand is up, so I think you should just be able to unmute and make a comment if you wish.
Thank you. As a side note, this is one of my favorite discussions and I'm fascinated by this process. So I appreciate the time that everyone is spending talking about this. I have a few comments on density. As we said in our letter, we worked hard not to take a position on density, knowing that it can be kind of a trigger issue and word. And I did find the exercise that Amanda went through to find examples. It was both in Bridge Street, Neck, and also throughout Salem of what the existing densities are. I found that really useful, I think, as a community to understand, because, as I said, density can be such a triggering topic. It was really helpful for me to see what this density that is being proposed looks like. And as it has been repeated, it's similar to the density that's found existing in the neighborhood. And a neighborhood, as we said in our letter, that was developed, it's sort of naturally walkable because it was developed before cars were easily accessed. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, you guys all froze, but so I think that existing, the other important part, as Amanda pointed out, is that the dimensional standards that were developed, that was one of my concerns as a member of the working group, to see if if the dimensional requirements would support this density, because having watched a lot of public review processes, I've seen where development teams will use one aspect to try to leverage another aspect. And so I think it's important that the density matches the dimensional standards. Otherwise, a higher density would be a way that a development team might ask for a bigger building than has been vetted by the community process. And I think so we support the existing density. I think if the density were increased, that examining those dimensional standards would be important, so that the community knows what to expect in development in that area. I just want to point out regarding those dimensional standards that we did do things like make sure that the setbacks on the street matched what was in the neighborhood, which allows, I think, a greater density on the site, because there's not a expansive front yard required, which is rare to find anywhere in Salem. So those type of things were closely examined to make sure that they were mirrored what's existing, and also were minimized in a way that I think allows the density that's proposed. And then in regards to new construction versus the existing, both density and existing housing stock, and allowing an additional density in the neighborhood does put development pressure on the existing buildings. So many places that are currently a small a affordable, naturally occurring affordable, because they've been held by the same owner for so long, suddenly would increase their value because you could build more units in that on that parcel. And I feel like this is anecdotal, but many times when a project is gutted and done a lot of major construction, what comes back on the market is a higher costing house. So everyone knows it's such a complicated issue, but a lot of these small A affordable housing that we find in historic buildings comes because it is a slightly older housing stock, and adding development pressure to those will increase turnover as the land value becomes higher. So anyway, thank you for considering. I just will restate that we hadn't taken a position on density, but we do now support the density because it was so well vetted in the community process. And in terms of incremental changes to our zoning, this is actually a fairly significant change to what any of the other existing zoning in the city. So it does make progress in allowing more housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Any other members of the public wish to speak on the density topic? If not, I will move it back to the council, the committee. Councillor Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. So in a vacuum, density doesn't equal affordability, sure, but we don't live in a vacuum. And Sheila Dillon, who's the housing director in Boston, has written extensively. She contradicts the view that just by creating housing, you create affordability. You have to, as some people have said, you have to have a different paradigm, which we don't have right now. The Halsted is a nice building, sure. And many of the buildings and developments that have happened are very nice, but they're maybe 10% at 80% or 10% at 60%. In my opinion, that hasn't helped our housing situation. It's not good enough. It's why we need other actions beyond just this overlay. And my view, and this will be the last thing I say about density, is I'm not suggesting we create a dense Bridge Street Neck neighborhood neighborhood. What I'm suggesting is without certain mechanisms like parking and density, to be able to have variances that allow those in certain circumstances, we are not going to have the affordability that we need. And I look at it, and people have said that Bridge Street is so dense. I mean, a little part of the Point is in Ward 5. The Point neighborhood is by far the densest neighborhood in Salem. It's not even close. And it is not just multifamilies. There's a couple of single families, but it is a dense neighborhood. And I'm not suggesting that we do anything other than create a system where we allow things to accommodate what we need. And that is significantly more affordability. And the only way we can do that is to have tenant protections or some kind of means for when a developer comes in and we have a specific, remedy, which is to have a certain ratio and percentage of affordability. That's it. And, this idea that this number, this 1,700 square feet is a magic number, or it's what the neighborhood association said they wanted. I don't like the muffler development. It doesn't have enough affordability. It doesn't. And it was originally developed to be a mixed use space, and it's not. So there's a lot of issues with that development, but it's not affordable. That's it. It's not affordable. And I'm just looking around my neighborhood, which is very similar to Bridge Street, maybe a little more dense. And I don't see people saying, I can't live in a space that's 800, 900, 1,100 square feet.
Thank you, Councillor Cohen. We are coming up on the 3-hour mark, so I would like to ask the committee if they, this is, I don't want to stifle any conversations, but I do feel we need to either move on this matter or move to continue, or make a motion as a committee to either continue the conversation or keep the density item as is and move on to the next item. Are there any motions or comments from the committee? Councillor Varela?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi. I would recommend we keep the density as is.
Thank you, Councillor Varela. So no changes. Seconded by Councillor Dominguez. I want to make, I'm sorry, 1 second. Sorry. Councillor Varela moved to make no changes, so there's really no need to vote on that motion, but that is, I guess if there's not another motion on the table to make any edits or any further discussion on that, we can move on to the next topic. Again, I don't want to shorten the conversation, but I do feel like it might be we can probably move on to the next topic. You good with that? Okay.
Okay, the next two items are, I think will be quick. This is the clarifying language. The planning board recommended substituting hedging for shrubbery, or essentially removing the term shrubbery and replacing it with hedging in section 3.4.A2. So that's where parking is located on the side of a building and visible from a street or adjacent properties. It shall be screened through densely planted hedging or fencing, which in the opinion of the planning board effectively screens parking and its quality positively contributes to the character of the neighborhood.
Not as many hands on this one as there was density. Any comments from the committee? Councillor Watson-Felt.
Thank you, Chair Riccardi, not being a member of the committee. I have to say, I found this part of the joint public hearing really informative and fascinating. I have a lot to learn about hedging and shrubbery and green space. And so I'm in full support of their recommendation on this one.
Thank you. Is there any members of the committee that might have a motion on this one or comment? Sorry, Councillor Dominguez?
Thank you. Motion to keep it. I mean, to accept the change.
A motion to accept a change to replace the word shrubbery with hedging in section 3.4.A2. Is there a second? Seconded by Councillor Presnewski. And Amanda, that was correct, right? We're just changing that one word from shrubbery to hedging?
Correct.
Any comments or questions? Shrubbery. Okay, roll call vote. Councillor Cohen?
Yep.
Councillor Presnewski?
Yes.
Councillor Dominguez?
Yes.
Councillor Varela?
Yes.
And myself is a yes. So that recommendation passes 5-0. Thank you. Is that all we have, Amanda, or is there one other item?
I have another item. This is to differentiate between common space, open space, and vehicular space. The planning board had pointed out that that they wanted to make sure that a driveway is not counted as the required open space and that sort of thing. And so the staff worked on this and came up with this updated language after the joint public hearing for you to consider. It's 8.7.8.1D. Open space requirements may include common roof decks, courtyards, yards, gardens, space for seating associated with eating establishments, and other communal spaces. So those are those shared spaces. But a private balcony and vehicular space, such as parking and driving lanes, are excluded from meeting the minimum requirement. That's the minimum requirement for open space that's required in the dimensional standards. Now I'll leave this language up in case you want to change it further.
Thank you, Amanda. I'll comment that I remember this one, and I appreciate the call out that parking spots are not included in the open space. I know my first apartment, I did use my parking spot as my open space, and we had our barbecue out there and we would chill out there, but I don't feel that should be included in the calculations. I appreciate the call out on that. Councillor Watson-Felt?
Thank you, Chair Riccardi, not being a member of the committee. Quick question through you to Amanda on this. Has this new language been vetted by the city solicitor? Or does it needs to be, or I don't know. I'm just curious if Beth has seen it.
Beth hasn't seen this, but what I had planned to do was provide her the entire package after Ola, because I didn't know what direction the ordinance would go in. But this appears to be within the four corners.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that clarification. Oh, and I agree with Councilor Riccardi.
Any other comments or questions from the committee or council or public? I'm gonna throw it all out there. No. If not, is there a motion from the committee? Being the chair, I can't make one myself, although I would on this matter, to accept the suggested language.
Motion to accept this motion. I mean, this change.
Councilor Dominguez moves to accept the revised language as presented, the clarification on common space, open space, and vehicular space, seconded by Councilor Varela. Seconded by Councilor Varela. And I'm going to do a roll call vote on that one. Councilor Cohen?
Yes.
Councilor Presnewski?
Yes.
Councilor Dominguez?
Yes.
Councilor Varela?
Yes.
And myself is a yes. So that moves 5-0. Any additional revisions or comments from the OLA committee that we would like, or the committee of the whole that we would like to discuss this evening? Going once, going twice. Oh. I think we made it. We still have members in the public here, so I will pull it out to one more final public comment period. If there are any other comments provided, please raise your hand. Okay, I think we have all bases covered here. If there is another motion from the committee, Councilor Dominguez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do we have to send it to the full council meeting with positive recommendation?
Correct, yes. So the next probably suggested motion would be to submit a recommendation to council for first passage as amended this evening.
So move.
So moved by Councilor Dominguez, seconded by
Second.
Councilor Varela. Any further discussion? Okay, roll call vote. Councilor Cohen?
Yes.
Councilor Presnewski?
Yes.
Councilor Dominguez?
Yes.
Councilor Varela?
Yes.
And myself is a yes, 5-0. So thank you all. Matter carries, that this will be our recommendation to the full council for passage as amended. In summary, the amendments that we made this evening were the two clarifying language amendments that we just made regarding shrubbery and open space clarification. And we also made that one motion earlier to change the design review board recommendation from a positive recommendation requirement to an advisory recommendation. So I'll make sure that Beth, I'm sure Amanda will help me with this, Beth reviews the revised edits, and we will make sure that the council has copies to review before our meeting on Thursday. Also, any public comments that I've been receiving, including the HSI one, have been dropped in our folder that we can all access, as well as the presentation that was shared this evening. I broke my own rule of going over the 2 hours, but I feel we had a very productive meeting, and I appreciate everyone's attention to this matter and this topic this evening. It was a lot to digest, but I think we did a great job. High five OLA and committee of the whole. Councilor Varela.
I can make a motion to adjourn.
Varela makes a motion to adjourn and seconded by
Second.
Councilor Dominguez. And since we're still virtual, we will do a roll call vote. Councilor Cohen?
I'd say no, except I want to watch the Celtics. So yeah, don't say the score. I'm taping it.
Who the who? No, I'm just kidding. Councilor Dominguez?
Yes.
Councilor Presnewski?
Yes.
And myself is a yes. Did I get you, Councilor Varela?
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. We're adjourned. Again, I appreciate everyone's attention to this matter this evening, and we will see you on Thursday in person. Good night.